I worked 15 years in a major metropolitan area as an X-ray tech on third shift. And not long after starting, I discovered how that shift got its name. But before I go into that, some backstory. By the time I started this job, initially part-time, I was in my late 20s and had worked in the field for 8 years, in doctors' offices and walk-in clinics. I was a big guy, 6'4", 275 pounds. Now I'm a disabled wreck, but after I give you some details, you'll probably understand why. Anyway, I was newly married, moved from out of state, and needed a second job to help pay the bills. This job, every other weekend from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. on Friday and Saturday night, was at a hospital that was actually closer to my house than my main job, so I thought I was very lucky. What luck. The interview went well. I had good references, and the department manager was a nice guy who said I'd be perfect. He described the job as an open all-night ambulatory clinic. Even though it was a level 3 trauma center, the lowest, the bad stuff went downtown, or so he said. The pay was good, and even though I dreaded going back into the hospital environment, it was the least favorite part of my 2,000-hour clinical training. This didn't sound all that bad, really. My first night, I worked with a girl who showed me the ropes. She showed me the trauma and cardiac rooms, where the portable X-ray machine was set up. The portable X-ray machines. I had forgotten about those when I applied. Anyway, she introduced me to the nurses, one who said, fresh meat, whatever that meant. One interesting feature was a rubber room for psych patients. The door had been obviously ripped off its hinges recently, and the hanging ceiling tiles and lights smashed in. And as we walked from the ER to the main X-ray department, I noticed the morgue was behind the wall to the ER X-ray control area. Creepy. At the main department, we went over all the important points, and then we did a mini hospital tour. 350 beds. It was a medium-sized hospital. It had 3 critical care units, one for cardiac, one for pediatrics, and another for everything else, called ICU. She showed me the portable X-ray machine for the main part of the hospital, and I was pretty much set. We worked for a few hours, and the ER slowed down, and so we chatted. I found out she had worked the second shift too and was pulling a double to train me. Shift differential and overtime was going towards her taking a small vacation to the mountains. Everything was going well until I was telling her that my neighbor said that my house was haunted. Then she immediately clammed up. I decided to change the subject and then half-jokingly asked what cyclone had been in the rubber room. If she looked clammy after I mentioned my house being haunted, she now looked petrified. They're lucky I stayed to train you tonight. After what happened earlier, I need a vacation more than ever. She proceeded to tell me about the John Doe that they brought in. He was dressed in all black with tattoos all over his arms, neck, chest, even his face. Oddly, she described them as runes. Well, not tattoos, she said. Welts, raised skin, even more odd. He was brought in after someone noticed him slumped over by a road. He arrived unconscious via ambulance and they put him in a cardiac room. I found out later that the EMS had, for some reason, just transported him here without doing their usual field evaluation. Anyway, she tells me she went to do his portable chest X-ray, and right when she leaned forward to put the film plate behind him, he awoke. His eyes were totally and completely red. And then he opened his mouth, and all of his teeth were filed, apparently into points. And then he let out a yell, growl, scream that almost made her soil herself. At some point, she told me, she recoiled and retreated just outside the room. The nurse missed the eyes and mouth. Her back was to the patient prepping an IV. When he screamed, though, she spun around in surprise and also retreated out of the door. And that left this man alone in the room with the X-ray machine. The bulk of the machine was by his left foot, and in a fit of rage, he kicked the thing halfway over into the cabinets. What I said stunned to hear this because a portable X-ray machine weighs hundreds of pounds. It's filled with batteries and a lead-lined area for the film. I couldn't believe that someone could just kick one over. She showed me the crease in the side that hit the cabinets. Luckily, it was still working. Well, she went on and said that they lucked out that security, off-duty police officers, were hanging in the nurse's station, It took all 4 of them and one of the male x-ray techs from the main department who was relieving her for a break to subdue the patient. Jeff, the tech, didn't fare well. His arm was twisted and snapped like a twig. Fresh meat, I thought. Although later I learned that this was just the tip of the iceberg for the meaning behind that comment. Anyway, they put him into a rubber room after sedating him, and they locked the doors. She overheard the head nurse and doctor saying things like, unnatural, unexplainable, impossible. And then she went on. Shortly after 7:45, she hears an ungodly racket coming from the rubber room. She is doing a portable x-ray in another part of the ER when a nurse frantically comes by, locking the patients in their rooms. She said she hurried back to the ER x-ray control room and locks herself in. After a couple of minutes, the ungodly screams and crashing noises stopped. She then says that she hears this loud thud again and again and again. It was so forceful that it felt like the floor was vibrating. She said that she called the nurse's station to see what was making the noise. John Doe, on the camera feed before it went out, had picked up his stretcher over his head and was using it as a battering ram on the steel door. At this point, I'm sitting there with my jaw dropped open, and I ask what happened after he knocked the door down. Well, the night security manager had arrived shortly before this happened. His day job was head of the county sheriff's SWAT team. He and his team tasered him, and that subdued him enough to let the nurses pump him up with Thorazine. But all that caused a cardiac event, and now he's in the ICU extension. What's that, I ask, and was told that it's basically an overflow for the times of year when we get more critical patients, but most of the time it's closed. She overheard that they put him in it to keep him away from the other patients. I wasn't surprised based on what he had done. Then she nervously added that there was one other thing. She tells me that she's heard whispers from the wall earlier tonight, the wall shared on the other side with the morgue. That's why she reacted the way she did when I mentioned that my house was haunted. So, I'm digesting all of this, trying to think of a rational explanation, and I glance at the wall and it says 3 a.m. The witching hour, I thought. No sooner had this entered my mind than blasting from the overhead comm system, reverberating through the hospital is, "Code, ICU extension, code." "I'm not going," was my coworker's immediate reaction, and I didn't blame her. I told her no problem, and as I left to head to the main x-ray department and that portable x-ray machine, I hear the control room door lock behind me. When I was in x-ray school on clinical rotation, we get a call saying a victim murdered by a man with a machine gun was coming into the morgue. They needed the body completely x-rayed for the trial. The man, a young attorney, was gunned down by a man whose mother was a client. She had died and left him nothing. First he killed her dog, and then he took its lifeless corpse with him to the attorney's office and gunned him down. I dreaded the thought of x-raying a dead man, and ended up helping a radiologist do a liver biopsy instead. I was dreading going to the unit and being anywhere near John Doe or whoever or whatever he was. I'm walking down the long corridor thinking all of this, and I pass the morgue door and I notice black dirt tracked in from the door where they bring the bodies from the hearses into the morgue to be pronounced dead by ER doctors. Whatever, have fun housekeeping, I think. Anyway, I get to the unit, head to the doorway that has the lights on, and go in. There's one nurse that is standing by an open window. The bed is empty, the cloth restraints torn apart. I asked her what happened. Well, he was literally on his deathbed all night, she said. His EKG showed tombstones, a term that she explained is what they called a cardiac rhythm that looks not only like tombstones on the monitor, but they also mean that death is usually imminent. She didn't know who made it or why the decision was made, but they were not to revive him if he coded. So she left the window open so that his spirit could find a way into the light. I later learned that this nurse was also a white witch. Anyway, I pointed out that they just called a code. Yes, she informs me, but apparently the hospital operator was so excited when contacted, she must have heard the scuttlebutt about John Doe too, because she forgot to say code blue, which is a security code, not a medical emergency code. He opened his eyes and escaped his restraints and jumped out the window, she said. But we're on the 4th floor, so I guess no more Mr. John Doe, I say. Well, not exactly, she says. You see, he got up after landing in a flower bed that they've been working on and headed towards the ER side of the hospital. I look and see, illuminated by nearby parking lot lights, in the flower bed, dark dirt, like I just saw coming in the hall by the morgue. Security is after him, she said. I arrive back in the ER. The on-duty police are everywhere. I find out that the security was hanging out in the ER earlier discussing several bodies brought into the morgue earlier that day, torn apart, apparently, by some type of animal. And now, apparently, some of the bodies are missing. I also overhear that witchcraft, or demon-worshipping paraphernalia, was found around the bodies. And apparently, the dark clothing of John Doe was splattered with dried blood. All of this happened over 25 years ago. John Doe was never found, and his true identity remains a mystery. The bodies were also never found, and none of this made the local news. Of course, we heard rumors of things happening for years after that, but who knows? Anyway, we were told to shut up about it and signed a non-disclosure agreement. Seems having patients jump out of windows can be bad for business, even if they're superhuman or whatever. I worked there another 15 years, eventually going full-time. Why? The money. But if I'm totally honest, this turned out to be the first of many, many, many strange events. And even though many were horrible and frightening, some part of me found it irresistible. Anyway, I live even closer to that hospital than before. Found a nice house with some woods behind it. As I sit here writing this, not long after the witching hour, I can barely make out an ungodly howl. I think I'll go and check it out.